Jessica Harper strode briskly down the long corridor leading to the boarding gate. Her uniform was crisp, her hair neatly pulled into a tight bun, and her polished black heels struck the floor with firm, confident steps, echoing the authority of a woman who was always in control. She had been with Sutton Airways for 12 years, rising to the position of lead flight attendant in the first class cabin. Here, everything had to be flawless, from the table linens to the service attitude, and Jessica embodied that perfection, or at least she always believed so. Today's flight from New York to Los Angeles, a 5.5 hour journey, was a route Jessica knew like the back of her hand. She relished the feeling of stepping into the first class cabin, a place reserved for successful business moguls, political figures, and A-list celebrities. In that luxurious space, Jessica felt like part of the elite, a gatekeeper of privilege, someone who held the power to decide who was worthy and who was not. As she entered the cabin, she immediately noticed Sarah Nolan, a young flight attendant who had been with the airline for just over a year. Sarah greeted her with a polite nod, her eyes still carrying traces of nervousness. Jessica responded with a slight nod, maintaining a cool, detached expression. She didn't dislike Sarah, but she didn't think much of her either. To Jessica, people like Sarah were mere apprentices, too green to understand the unspoken rules of the first-class domain. Passengers began to board. Tailored suits, designer handbags, and gleaming luxury watches flashed under the cabin's soft lighting. Jessica offered a warm smile to each guest, though her eyes remained sharp, quietly assessing every person who stepped through the door. And then she appeared. Margaret Sutton entered the cabin with a calm, composed air. She wore a modest navy blue suit, carried a well-worn leather handbag, and had on a pair of simple low-heeled shoes. Her silver-white hair was neatly pinned up, and her face bore the lines of age, marks of a life well lived rather than mere frailty. Jessica's attention sharpened immediately. With her trained eye, she could tell Margaret was unlike the typical first-class passenger. There was no designer bag, no extravagant jewelry, no flawless makeup. Jessica's instincts told her, this woman did not belong here. Sarah greeted Margaret with a gentle smile, her voice soft and welcoming. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I hope you have a pleasant flight." Margaret returned the greeting with a polite nod. But Jessica, standing a few steps away with her arms crossed, watched with suspicion. When Margaret handed her boarding pass to Sarah to scan, Jessica stepped forward. She glanced at the ticket, her eyes narrowing slightly as she noticed seat 1A, a spot usually reserved for the most important individuals. "Excuse me, ma'am. Let me verify your ticket." Jessica extended her hand, her tone laced with doubt. Margaret maintained her gentle smile and handed the ticket over once more. Jessica scanned the information on the ticket. First class, seat 1A. Everything was correct. Yet something still felt off. She had grown far too familiar with the regular faces in this exclusive cabin, and Margaret was a stranger, an anomaly. "Would you mind waiting here for a moment, ma'am?" Jessica said, her smile stiff and rehearsed. "I just need to verify a few details." Sarah flinched slightly, about to say something, but fell silent the moment she caught Jessica's sharp gaze. Margaret, however, remained composed. She gave a gentle nod and stepped aside, standing quietly near a seat. No one noticed the faint glimmer of understanding in her eyes. Jessica turned on her heel and briskly made her way to the crew phone, dialing the ticketing desk through the internal line. Her voice dropped low, just enough to ensure Sarah couldn't overhear. After a brief exchange, she received confirmation. Margaret's ticket was perfectly valid. Everything was in order. Jessica returned to the cabin, though a sense of unease still lingered. She told herself, maybe it was a last-minute upgrade, but someone like her, how could she end up here? What Jessica failed to realize was that her arrogance and prejudice had already begun weaving the threads of her own downfall. By now, Margaret had taken her seat in 1A. She carefully placed her handbag by her feet, that pulled out an old hardcover book with worn edges and began reading, seemingly unbothered by the earlier scrutiny. But Sarah was different. She still felt uneasy about Jessica's behavior. Moments before takeoff, as Jessica conducted her final cabin check, her gaze once again lingered on Margaret, clouded with silent judgment. What she didn't know was that the elderly woman seated before her was Margaret Sutton, the mother of Michael Sutton, chairman and largest shareholder of Sutton Airways, And what Jessica couldn't possibly know was that this flight would change her life forever. The flight had been in the air for about an hour. Outside the window, the endless expanse of blue sky stretched far and wide, with clusters of soft white clouds drifting below. Inside the first class cabin, everything seemed to have settled into a comfortable rhythm. Most passengers had relaxed, some reading, others sipping wine, and a few taking the opportunity to catch a quick nap. But for Jessica Harper, the unease in her chest continued to simmer. Each time she passed seat 1A, her eyes instinctively flicked toward Margaret Sutton. The elderly woman sat upright, her eyes calmly gliding over the pages of her book, occasionally pausing to take a sip of water. There was something about her that irritated Jessica, though she couldn't quite explain why. Maybe it was the way Margaret carried herself, so composed, so different from the usual first-class clientele, the kind who demanded attention, reveled in being pampered, and never missed a chance to flaunt their wealth. But Margaret, she was too simple. So simple it was unsettling. Jessica's thoughts drifted to the conversation she'd had earlier at the galley with a couple, frequent first-class travelers who had voiced their displeasure. The husband, in a low voice, had grumbled about being seated near some poor old lady. His wife had added in a hushed but cutting tone, "People like that? How could they afford this cabin?" Jessica had nodded along, even cracking a few jokes to match their tone. She hadn't said anything outright cruel, but her agreement had been clear. In Jessica's mind, someone like Margaret didn't belong here. Just then, Sarah Nolan, the young flight attendant, approached, her usual friendly smile in place. She spoke softly. "Jessica, the couple in 2C and 2D asked for another glass of wine. I took care of it, but they also complained about the passenger in 1A." Jessica smirked. "I figured as much." Sarah hesitated. "Do you think we should say something to her? I mean, she seems perfectly polite. She hasn't done anything wrong." Jessica let out a dry chuckle. "Sometimes just someone's presence is enough to make others uncomfortable." Sarah frowned slightly. She knew this side of Jessica all too well. It wasn't the first time she had seen her superior subtly undermine passengers she deemed unworthy of first class. But this time felt different. There was something about the woman in seat 1A, Margaret Sutton, that struck Sarah as unusual. There was a quiet dignity about her, an aura that didn't demand respect but naturally commanded it. Jessica didn't care what her colleague thought. She marched straight to Margaret's seat, her tone maintaining a veneer of politeness, but her eyes betrayed thinly veiled contempt. "Ma'am, may I have a moment of your time?" Jessica spoke, though it was less of a question and more of a demand. Margaret looked up, her expression calm and composed. "Is there a problem, miss?" Jessica folded her arms across her chest, casting a brief glance toward the couple in 2C, before lowering her voice to a measured yet authoritative tone. "It seems there's been a mix-up with your seat assignment. We've reviewed the situation, and it appears there's been an overlap with seat 1A. We'll need to reassign you to a more appropriate seat in the economy cabin." The atmosphere shifted. A few nearby passengers subtly turned their heads, sensing the tension. Margaret held Jessica's gaze, her eyes now sharper, something only visible to those who paid close attention. "My ticket is for first class, seat 1A," Margaret replied slowly, her voice steady. Jessica paused for a split second, but quickly regained her professional facade. "Yes, I understand. However, there's been an adjustment today. We need to prioritize certain distinguished passengers." Margaret pressed her lips together and placed her book on her lap. "And what kind of passenger do you consider me to be?" The question landed like a slap across Jessica's face. Her smile stiffened, but her pride refused to back down. In her mind, the thought was clear. An old black woman like you doesn't belong here. She forced her tone to remain even. "You know, I'm simply following policy, ma'am." Margaret's gaze sharpened further, cutting through Jessica's pretense like a knife. "If there is truly an issue with my seat, I would like to speak directly with the captain." Jessica's heart skipped a beat. The request hit her like a splash of cold water. Asking to see the captain, that was a passenger's right when they felt mistreated. But few ever dared to exercise it, especially in situations like this. The challenge made Jessica's frustration flare. She clenched her teeth, her voice lowering with barely concealed irritation. Ma'am, we can resolve this internally. There's no need to escalate the situation. But Margaret didn't flinch. Her voice remained unwavering. I believe I have the right to speak to the captain. Jessica felt cornered. The passengers around her had started to take notice. Some watched with curiosity, while others cast subtle, judgmental glances her way. From across the cabin, Sarah observed the situation anxiously, her eyes filled with concern. Just then, a man in seat 3B cleared his throat, seemingly about to speak up in defense of Margaret. But the moment Jessica shot him a sharp glare, he quickly lowered his head, pretending to be engrossed in the screen in front of him. The tension in the air was palpable, so taut that the slightest spark could set it ablaze. Jessica swallowed her anger. Fine, I'll call the captain, she said, her voice clipped. Without waiting for a response, she spun on her heel and marched toward the front of the cabin. Her fists clenched so tightly that her nails dug into her palms. Rage boiled beneath her composed exterior. An old woman, challenging me here in first class. Before stepping into the crew communication area, Jessica shot one last glance back at Margaret. The older woman remained in her seat, arms folded across her chest, exuding a calmness that was almost defiant. Jessica had no idea that in that very moment, when she mistook composure for weakness, the balance of power had already slipped from her grasp, and the nightmare awaiting her was only just beginning. Jessica Harper strode briskly toward the front of the first-class cabin, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. Anger churned in her chest, but she kept her face composed. Pride was in her blood. She still believed she was in control. A stubborn old woman like Margaret Sutton, no matter how defiant, would eventually yield. They always did. Standing before the intercom system, Jessica took a deep breath and pressed the call button. Captain Brooks, this is Jessica Harper from First Class. I need assistance regarding a seating issue with a passenger. Captain William Brooks's voice crackled through the line, calm but edged with the focus of someone busy in the cockpit. What seems to be the issue, Miss Harper? Lowering her voice, Jessica fought to maintain her professional tone, though all she truly wanted was to banish Margaret to economy. An elderly passenger in seat 1A is refusing to move, despite my explanation of a seating conflict. She's requesting to speak with the captain. There was a brief pause before Captain Brooks responded. I'm tied up in the cockpit, but if her ticket matches the seat, there's no reason to move her. Just verify the ticket, and that should be the end of it. Jessica bit the inside of her cheek, disappointed. She had expected stronger support, but she knew she couldn't argue over the intercom indefinitely. Cutting the call, she turned back toward the cabin, her anger now boiling over. Margaret Sutton remained in seat 1A, as composed as ever, seemingly unaffected by the situation. Her calmness felt like a personal challenge to Jessica. Striding directly to her seat, Jessica abandoned any pretense of politeness. Ma'am, the captain has confirmed your ticket is valid. However, I do hope you understand, this seat is typically reserved for more distinguished passengers. Jessica stretched the word distinguished, lacing it with unmistakable condescension. Margaret slowly raised her eyes, their sharpness cutting through her modest appearance. Are you suggesting I am not distinguished enough to sit here? Her voice was steady, deliberate, each word landing like a precise blade against Jessica's pride. Around them, other passengers began to take notice. Some exchanged annoyed glances, displeased with the disturbance, but most sensed the rising tension and discreetly watched. Jessica felt cornered. She knew the situation was slipping from her grasp, but instead of backing down, she made a dangerous choice. She pushed forward. She would not be humiliated in front of first-class passengers. Ma'am, I am simply ensuring that all guests enjoy the most comfortable experience possible. If you're unhappy, I can assist you in moving to an available seat in economy. You're asking me to vacate my seat? Margaret interrupted, her voice calm but now carrying an unmistakable authority. It wasn't loud, but it was powerful, the kind of voice that turned heads and commanded attention. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Sarah Nolan stood a few seats away, her face pale. She gave a subtle shake of her head, silently pleading with Jessica to stop. But it was too late. Jessica stepped forward, leaning in close to Margaret, her voice dropping into a low, firm warning. I am trying to help you, but if you continue to be this uncooperative, I'll have no choice but to call ground security when we land. Silence. Margaret calmly closed her book and placed it on her lap. Her eyes locked onto Jessica's, piercing through every layer of pretense. Go ahead, try putting your hands on me. The words, quiet but defiant, poured gasoline onto the fire already raging inside Jessica. Her temper flared. Without thinking, she reached out, gripping Margaret's wrist, intending to pull her up from the seat. But then, smack! The sharp crack of a slap shattered the tense stillness. The sound rang through the cabin, cutting through every conversation, every rustle of fabric. Passengers froze. Some flinched and turned fully in their seats. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, eyes wide with shock. Jessica stood in stunned disbelief. Had she had she just slapped a passenger? Here? In front of everyone? Margaret's head tilted slightly from the force of the slap, but she didn't recoil in pain or lash out in anger. Instead, she slowly turned her face back toward Jessica. Her gaze wasn't furious, it was filled with something far worse: profound disappointment. That look pierced Jessica deeper than any shout or insult ever could. Her pulse raced. For the first time, fear crept into her chest. She realized she had gone too far. Margaret said nothing. She simply reached for her phone, calmly typing a brief message before setting it down on the armrest. Folding her arms, she leaned back into her seat, her posture one of quiet expectation, as though she was waiting for something inevitable. Jessica forced a strained smile, though her voice trembled slightly. Ma'am, I'm so sorry. Before she could finish, the overhead intercom crackled to life. A deep male voice, cold and commanding, filled the first-class cabin. Jessica Harper, would you like to repeat what you just did to my mother? The cabin froze. Every head turned. Mouths hung open in shock. Sarah nearly dropped the tray she was holding. Jessica stood paralyzed, her heart racing. Mother, her blood ran cold. She instantly recognized the voice: Michael Sutton, the chairman and largest shareholder of Sutton Airways, the most powerful figure in the company, a man who could end careers with a single call. And the woman she had just slapped was his mother. Jessica felt her knees weaken beneath her. Her lips quivered as she stammered, I didn't know. Michael Sutton cut her off, his tone growing even icier. I don't care what you knew. I asked you, would you like to repeat what you just did to my mother? Cold sweat trickled down Jessica's back. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Her voice had abandoned her. Margaret remained still, her face composed, radiating the same quiet authority she had maintained all along, as though none of this was a surprise. The tension in the cabin was suffocating. Every passenger watched in breathless silence. Jessica knew. The career she spent 12 years building, everything she had prided herself on, was now hanging by a thread, and that thread was seconds from snapping. Jessica Harper stood frozen in the middle of the first-class cabin. Her feet felt glued to the floor, arms limp at her sides, and sweat soaked through the back of her uniform. Her mind was blank except for the single phrase that echoed like a relentless drum. Would you like to repeat what you just did to my mother? That voice, Michael Sutton, chairman of Sutton Airways, the most powerful figure in the commercial aviation industry, and the woman Jessica had just slapped, Margaret Sutton, was his mother. Her world was collapsing. She had made the mistake no flight attendant would ever dare to imagine. She had crossed the family of a man who held the careers and futures of tens of thousands of employees in his hands, including hers. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin was suffocating, thick with tension that felt ready to detonate. Passengers sat motionless, holding their breath, eyes wide. Some discreetly raised their phones, recording the unfolding disaster. Jessica could hear the hushed murmurs ripple through the cabin. Did she really slap Michael Sutton's mother? Oh my God, she's done for. She's definitely getting fired. Jessica swallowed hard, her throat dry, hands trembling at her sides. She cast a desperate glance toward Margaret Sutton, but the older woman remained seated, composed, as though nothing had happened. No anger, no indignation, no demands, just calm, unnerving silence. That terrified Jessica even more. She understood people with true power didn't need to shout. They didn't need to create a scene. Sometimes a simple look from them was enough to alter the course of someone's entire life. Suddenly, the intercom crackled to life, shattering the tense stillness. The steady, authoritative voice of Captain William Brooks filled the cabin. Flight attendant Jessica Harper, you are to immediately step away from your duties and take a seat in the passenger section at the rear of the aircraft. Your service on this flight is hereby suspended. This is a direct order from Mr. Michael Sutton. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. It felt like being yanked out of a nightmare, except this was real. Her eyes widened in shock, darting toward the front of the cabin. Sarah Nolan, her junior colleague, stood pale and speechless, horror etched across her face. And then Thomas Clark, the senior flight supervisor, appeared from the galley. His stride was firm, his expression a stern mixture of disappointment and professionalism. His eyes, cold and unforgiving, locked onto Jessica as he approached. There was no escape. "Jessica, did you copy that?" Captain Brooks's voice came through the intercom again, firm and unmistakable. Jessica flinched, her throat tightening as she forced out a trembling response. "Yes, I understand." Thomas Clark stepped forward, his tone low but resolute. "Get up and come with me. Now." Jessica felt every pair of eyes burning into her as she rose. Her legs were weak, her body drained of strength. She had never felt so exposed, so stripped bare before an audience. As she passed Margaret Sutton's seat, Jessica dared to steal a glance, desperation flickering in her eyes, silently pleading for forgiveness, for mercy. Margaret looked up, her expression composed but icy. She said nothing. She simply watched. That look, calm yet merciless, cut deeper than any reprimand or shouting ever could. Jessica was escorted by Thomas Clark past the rows of pristine first-class seats, through the divider into economy. The shift in atmosphere was jarring. The passengers in coach turned their heads, confused, unaware of what had transpired. But Jessica knew it wouldn't be long before they found out. Stories like this spread faster than turbulence. By the time they landed, her name would likely already be circulating far beyond this cabin. She was led to an aisle seat near the rear, uncomfortably close to the lavatories. It was a seat typically reserved for last-minute bookings, the kind of seat seasoned travelers scorned. For Jessica, it felt like a public execution, a silent proclamation that she had fallen from the elite realm of first class to the most undesirable corner of the aircraft. She lowered her head, hands clasped tightly together, heart hammering in her chest. Sweat beaded along her forehead, trickling down her neck, but she didn't dare lift a hand to wipe it away. The seconds dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Her colleagues continued their duties with forced normalcy, but the tension in the air was undeniable. Sarah Nolan, in particular, glanced toward the back of the plane from time to time, her face a mix of pity and relief. She was grateful she hadn't followed Jessica's lead earlier. 30 agonizing minutes later, Thomas Clark returned. This time his approach was clinical. He carried a notepad, his eyes void of warmth. "Jessica, I need a formal account of what happened. Be honest. Everything is on camera, and we have witness statements. I expect you to cooperate." Jessica looked up, her eyes red and glassy. She knew the truth. Nothing she said would matter now. The cameras, the passengers, and above all, Margaret Sutton's presence had sealed her fate. Her voice cracked as she began. I was just trying to do my job. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." But even as the words left her lips, she knew they were weak, hollow. Tears welled up and slid down her cheeks. For the first time in her 12-year career, Jessica Harper felt utterly powerless. When she finished, Thomas gave a small nod, professional, detached. "I'll be filing this report directly to Mr. Sutton upon landing. I can't guarantee what will happen next." Jessica nodded back, her movements mechanical. She didn't need to ask, she already knew. As Thomas left, Jessica leaned back in her seat, eyes squeezed shut. Images flashed in her mind, her pristine uniform, her proud strides through the cabin, the respect she once commanded from passengers and crew alike. All of it likely gone, and when the plane touched down, she knew the real storm would begin. This time, there would be no escape. Jessica Harper sat huddled in the last row, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. The hum of the economy cabin felt distant, muffled, as though she were sealed inside a glass box, cut off from the world around her. Her mind spiraled with chaotic thoughts, but one feeling overpowered everything else: fear. She had been suspended, mid-flight, and the one who had issued that order was none other than Michael Sutton, chairman of Sutton Airways. The woman she had slapped, Margaret Sutton, was his mother. Jessica had crossed a line that no flight attendant dared approach. This wasn't just about disrespecting a passenger. She had humiliated the family of the man who held the keys to her entire career. The moment the plane touched down, her life could be irrevocably changed, for the worse. Her throat felt parched. Cold sweat continued to trickle down her spine. She had never felt so small, so powerless. The years she had spent reigning over the first-class cabin, the authority she had wielded over passengers, the pride she took in being the one who dictated the rules, were now nothing but distant memories. She was no longer in control. She had been discarded, stripped of everything she had built. Just then, she noticed Sarah Nolan making her way toward the back of the cabin for a routine passenger check. Their eyes met. Sarah hesitated, then approached. "Jessica, are you okay?" Sarah asked softly, concern evident in her voice. Jessica tried to force a smile, but her lips trembled. I I don't know." Sarah exhaled slowly. She knew Jessica had been wrong, but she also understood that for someone as proud and strong-willed as Jessica, this kind of public humiliation was the cruelest blow to her dignity. "Listen, I think you should apologize. Now, don't wait until we land," Sarah urged, her tone gentle but firm. Jessica's eyes widened. Apologize? In her 12 years as a flight attendant, she had uttered countless apologies for minor inconveniences, delayed meals, misplaced blankets, but she had never truly lowered herself before anyone. Her pride had always been her armor. But now she realized clinging to that pride might cost her everything. She swallowed hard and gave Sarah a weak nod. "Thank you," she whispered. She stood up, her steps slow and heavy as though shackled with weights. Each stride along the narrow aisle felt like a march toward judgment. Passengers in the economy cabin turned their heads, whispering among themselves. Some had caught wind of the commotion in first class. A few looked at her with scorn, others with curiosity, but none of that mattered anymore. As Jessica stepped back into the first-class cabin, it felt like walking into a courtroom. The gazes here were sharper, belonging to people of wealth and power who already knew who she was and what she had done. To them, she was no longer the polished face of Sutton Airways. She was a condemned figure awaiting sentencing. She halted in front of seat 1A. Margaret Sutton sat there, as composed and elegant as ever. She sipped from a cup of tea freshly served by one of the attendants, her demeanor betraying no trace of the incident. But Jessica knew this was the woman who now held the key to her fate. Jessica swallowed hard and bowed her head. "Mrs. Sutton, I sincerely apologize for my inappropriate behavior earlier. I was wrong. I deeply regret my actions. Please, I ask for your forgiveness." Margaret set her teacup down, lifting her gaze to meet Jessica's. Her eyes were sharp, not with anger, but with the kind of wisdom that cut deeper. That made it worse. The absence of rage made Jessica feel the full weight of her own disgrace. Margaret remained silent for a moment before speaking, her voice low and steady. "Are you apologizing because I'm Michael's mother, or because you truly understand that what you did was wrong?" Jessica froze. She hadn't expected such a direct question. It pierced her pride like a knife. She hesitated, but knew that evasion now would be the final nail in her coffin. "I. I'm apologizing because I was wrong." Jessica's voice trembled. "It has nothing to do with anyone else. I treated you unfairly, as a passenger, as a person. I'm truly sorry." Margaret studied her for a few more seconds, then gave a small nod. "I accept your apology, but—" Jessica's heart lurched. "I am not the one who decides your future. That is my son." Jessica bit her lip, the glimmer of hope fading as quickly as it had come. Margaret was right. Her forgiveness might offer emotional relief, but the power to decide Jessica's fate lay solely with Michael Sutton. And from the icy tone she had heard over the intercom earlier, Jessica knew he was not a man easily swayed by words. "Thank you for hearing me out," Jessica whispered, bowing deeply before turning away. She walked back to her seat at the rear of the plane, her steps dragging, her body heavy with defeat. Collapsing into the cramped aisle seat, she buried her face in her hands. Tears welled up and spilled over. Tears not just of regret, but of dread. It was the crushing realization that no matter what she said, no matter how sincere her apology had been, the damage was likely beyond repair. Her future, everything she had built over 12 years, was slipping away, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. For the remainder of the flight, Jessica sat still, silent, Her heart pounded relentlessly, each thump reminding her of the inevitable. She stared blankly ahead, feeling the cabin hum around her, but none of it registered. She knew the real reckoning would come when the plane touched down, and Jessica Harper wasn't sure if she would have the strength to face it. As the announcement crackled through the cabin speakers, signaling the plane's descent into Los Angeles, Jessica Harper felt her heart race wildly. She sat rigid in her seat, fingers digging into her thighs, eyes staring blankly out the window. She had apologized. But was that enough? She knew that the moment the wheels touched the ground, her career could very well be over. If Michael Sutton decided to terminate her, it wouldn't just be Sutton Airways shutting its doors on her. Every airline in the industry would hear about it. She'd be blacklisted, erased from the ranks of professional flight attendants. 12 years of hard work, pride, and status, all reduced to nothing in an instant. The landing gear made contact with the runway, the gentle thud reverberating through the cabin. It was a smooth landing, but to Jessica, it sounded like a death knell. Around her, passengers stirred, unbuckling seatbelts, reaching for overhead compartments. But Jessica remained frozen, trapped in her seat, paralyzed by the unknown awaiting her beyond the cabin door. She didn't know what was coming, but she knew it was coming for her. Just as the plane came to a complete stop, another announcement filled the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated for a few moments. There are operational procedures that need to be addressed before disembarkation. Confused murmurs rippled through the passengers. In first class, a few exchanged glances, some sighed in mild annoyance. But Jessica knew the truth. This was for her. The aircraft door finally opened. Within seconds, a team of senior airport officials and security personnel boarded the plane. Leading the group was Amanda Walker, Sutton Airways' director of operations. Her face was stern, her stride purposeful. Close behind was James Bennett, a younger supervisor known for handling disciplinary actions. His expression was tight, professional, but his eyes, when they flicked briefly toward Jessica, carried the weight of what was to come. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. This was it. And finally, he appeared. A tall, commanding figure, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, Michael Sutton. The entire first-class cabin fell silent. Conversations halted. Even the faint rustling of newspapers and the clinking of glasses ceased. Everyone held their breath. Jessica felt every nerve in her body tighten. She didn't dare meet his eyes. Her head hung low, hands clenched tightly together on her lap. Michael Sutton moved with measured control, his steps deliberate as he approached seat 1A. He leaned down slightly, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable weight of authority and concern. "Are you all right, Mother?" Margaret Sutton looked up at her son and gave a gentle smile. "I'm fine, my dear." Jessica bit down on her lower lip. That brief exchange, so simple, so full of respect and warmth, made her shame burn even hotter. Michael Sutton, the most powerful man in the company, still treated his mother with reverence. And she, Jessica, had humiliated that same woman, reducing her to nothing more than an outsider who didn't belong. Michael turned. For the first time, his eyes met Jessica's. It wasn't rage that stared back at her, but something far more cutting. Cold, controlled disappointment. A gaze that stripped away any pretense of power or pride she once held. In that moment, Jessica felt like nothing more than a small, pitiful figure awaiting judgment. The silence was suffocating. And then Michael spoke. "Miss Jessica Harper." His voice was steady, each word deliberate, like a gavel striking down. Jessica swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Yes, Mr. Sutton." He didn't let her finish. "I don't care how long you've worked here. I don't care how many VIPs you've served, or what level of authority you think you hold on these flights. Today, you made a mistake that is inexcusable." Jessica's chest tightened. She had braced for this moment, but hearing those words from Michael Sutton himself made it all the more devastating. He continued, his tone growing colder. "You didn't just disrespect a passenger. You humiliated my mother. You judged her based on her appearance, and you took it upon yourself to decide who is worthy of first class and who is not. But worst of all, you resorted to violence." Jessica parted her lips to speak, to defend herself, to explain, but Michael raised a hand, silencing her. "I don't need your excuses. I've seen the footage, and I cannot allow someone like you to remain in my airline." Jessica's heart plummeted into a dark void. Her vision blurred, and it felt as though the strength had been drained from every limb. It was over. Michael turned to Amanda Walker, his voice firm and final. Effective immediately, Jessica Harper is terminated from Sutton Airways. Place her on the industry blacklist. She is never to work as a flight attendant for any commercial airline again. Gasps rippled through the first class cabin. A few passengers' mouths hung open in shock. They had expected Jessica to be fired, but blacklisted from the entire industry? That was more than punishment. That was a lifetime sentence. Jessica's head spun, her vision blurred. She couldn't believe what she had just heard. Everything. Everything she had built over 12 years, gone. Because of one mistake, a single moment of arrogance. And now her entire career was being erased. Panic surged through her. She looked up, eyes wide, desperate. "Mr. Sutton, please, I'm truly sorry. I beg you, just give me one more chance." Michael met her gaze. There was no anger, no cruelty, just the cold, unyielding certainty of a man who had made his decision. "I don't give second chances to people who don't respect others." Jessica opened her mouth to plead further, but her throat tightened. Tears welled up and spilled down her cheeks. For the first time in her life, she understood there were some mistakes you couldn't undo. She had gone too far, and now there was no way back. Michael turned to the security team. "Escort her off the plane." "Shh!" Two security officers stepped forward. Jessica tensed, instinctively pulling back. Tears streamed freely as she was gently but firmly guided toward the exit. No one in the first class cabin spoke up for her. No sympathetic glance. No whispered support. The passengers watched in silence, as though absorbing a cautionary tale. As she was led past the rows of seats, Jessica's eyes landed on Margaret Sutton one last time. The older woman sat as she had throughout, calm, composed, neither triumphant nor vindictive. Margaret didn't need to seek revenge. Jessica's own actions had been her punishment. The walk down the jet bridge was worse than any nightmare. Passengers waiting at the gate turned their heads. Phones were raised, flashes, videos. Whispers turned into buzzing chatter. By tomorrow, the world would know the name Jessica Harper, but not as a symbol of success, as a symbol of downfall. Jessica Harper's story is a powerful reminder that power and position are never excuses to treat others unfairly. A single moment of arrogance, a single act of prejudice, destroyed the career she had proudly built over 12 years. But the most important lesson we can take from this story is this: always treat everyone with respect and kindness, regardless of who they are or how they appear. Because you never know. The person you look down on today may hold the key to changing your life tomorrow. If you resonate with this message, leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications to join us in spreading stories of kindness and respect. YouTube channel Stories About Kindness. Together, we can build a better world, one small act of kindness at a time. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.